Culture is not an accessory to organizational life. It is the invisible architecture that supports or undermines every interaction, every policy, every goal. The belief that one can install culture like software after the fact is a dangerous illusion. Culture is not a department, nor a slogan on the wall. It is what people do repeatedly, often unconsciously, especially when no one is watching. It emerges out of the norms, values, stories, and rituals that govern how people treat one another and interpret their work. The absence of deliberate culture does not mean the absence of culture. It means a culture of confusion, fear, or apathy will evolve by default. Human beings are meaning-seeking creatures. We do not operate well in vacuums. When an organization fails to provide a coherent cultural narrative, individuals will create their own. And when those narratives conflict, when one person sees their role as service, another as dominance, another as mere survival, the organization begins to splinter. What holds people together isn't just a common task. It's a shared ethos about how that task is pursued and why it matters. Culture, then, is not just a background variable. It is the medium in which all motivation and coordination occur. At its core, culture answers the fundamental question: how do we behave here and why? The unspoken norms around responsibility, initiative, and respect shape behavior far more than any rule book ever could. If culture rewards caution over courage, compliance over competence, then even the most ambitious will learn to shrink to fit the mold. In this way, culture does not just shape the organization, it shapes the people within it. It either elevates them to responsibility or drags them into resentment and mediocrity. Every organization transmits its culture through the tone of emails, the layout of the office, the way meetings are run, the kind of jokes that are tolerated. It is not accidental that in high-trust environments, people speak openly, admit mistakes, and offer feedback. These are cultural behaviors, not merely personal quirks. When trust is baked into the culture, individuals feel psychologically safe to bring their full selves to the table. But when culture is dominated by fear, control, or ambiguity, people resort to defense mechanisms. Silence, avoidance, sabotage. Leadership that ignores culture often finds itself bewildered by dysfunction. Why don't people innovate? Why is no one accountable? The answer is seldom about skills or intelligence. It is about the invisible rules of the game. If people are punished for risk, praised for flattery, or ignored entirely, they adapt accordingly. Culture trains people how to survive. Leaders who don't like the outcomes they're getting must first examine the cultural soil they've allowed to take root. You cannot outsource culture. Can host a training, consultants can draft a manifesto, but culture is built in the everyday grind. Through how conflict is handled, how credit is shared, how failure is interpreted. Culture is the cumulative result of 1,000 micro-decisions made by people who either believe in the system or don't. It grows in the spaces between formal processes, in the emotional undertones of meetings, in the look exchanged when someone gets away with bad behavior. What's more, culture is adaptive. It evolves in response to what is rewarded and what is tolerated. If cynicism goes unchecked, it spreads. If excellence is recognized, it inspires. If leadership models integrity, others follow. You don't get to choose whether you're creating culture. You only get to choose what kind. And once a culture is established, it resists change fiercely. It defends itself through rationalizations, groupthink, and social pressure, making deliberate transformation incredibly difficult and incredibly necessary. Culture, then, is both a mirror and a compass. It reflects. People begin to guard themselves instead of contribute. They calculate instead of commit. Trust, fundamentally, is the assumption that others will act in ways that are predictable, honest, and aligned with shared goals. Strip that away, and you do not simply have conflict, you have chaos. You have a collection of isolated individuals navigating ambiguity with suspicion rather than with shared purpose. The human nervous system is built to detect threats. In an environment where people feel unsafe, psychologically, professionally, or ethically, they default to protection. That protection might look like silence in meetings, refusal to take initiative, or passive resistance to leadership. These aren't moral failings, they're survival strategies. People can't thrive where they don't feel safe. They cannot be creative, or vulnerable, or honest in the absence of trust. What seems like apathy or disengagement is often fear in disguise. Trust must be earned, but more critically, it must be maintained. It is astonishingly easy to destroy. A single betrayal of principle, a single act of hypocrisy from leadership, can unravel months or even years of hard-earned confidence. That's because trust is a prediction mechanism. If your experience tells you that rules only apply selectively, or that promises are routinely broken, you stop investing in the system. You stop believing that good behavior will be rewarded, and you begin to hedge your bets. And yet, paradoxically, trust requires risk. It requires a willingness to act without full certainty, to believe in good faith, even when you have the option to withdraw. Organizations thrive when people make that leap, when they go the extra mile, when they take ownership, when they cover a teammate's failure without resentment. But no one takes that risk without some assurance that it won't be punished. Trust is not just emotional, it's rational. People trust systems that are just transparent and consistent. When leaders assume that trust will follow authority, they invert the natural order. You can coerce obedience, but you cannot mandate loyalty. People might nod along in meetings, but in private, they disengage. They build backup plans. They say yes, and mean only if I have to. True trust only develops when people see alignment between what leaders say and what they do. When promises are kept, when bad behavior is confronted, when vulnerability is respected rather than exploited, the smallest gestures matter. A boss who admits an error signals to the team that accountability is not a trap, it's a standard. A colleague who follows through on a deadline, even when no one is watching, reinforces that reliability is real. These moments are the atoms of trust. And when these moments accumulate, they form a culture where people can breathe, where they can speak freely, where they can extend themselves without waiting for the knife to drop. Trust is also contagious. And a few people model it authentically. Others begin to mirror it. It sets a tone. But the inverse is equally true. When a few bad actors go unchecked, distrust proliferates like mold in a damp wall. And here's the tragedy. Distrust spreads faster than trust ever could, because people are wired to remember betrayal more vividly than reliability. You can build trust with 10 good actions and lose it with one moment of cowardice or cruelty. Trust is not soft. It is not sentimental. It is the hardened infrastructure of functional teams, healthy communication, and long-term performance. It creates the conditions for competence to emerge, for conflict to be productive, and for goals to be pursued with shared conviction. Without it, you don't just lose cohesion, you lose the capacity for excellence itself. Hierarchy is inevitable. It arises wherever there is complexity, whenever coordination and leadership become necessary. To pretend that we can abolish hierarchies is to misunderstand the nature of responsibility itself. The real question is not whether hierarchies should exist, but what principles should determine their structure. And the only sustainable answer, ethically, functionally, and psychologically, is competence. When hierarchies are built on anything else, favoritism, manipulation, politics, the result is resentment, decay, and cynicism. Competence is the capacity to solve problems within a given domain. It is not the same as charm, nor charisma, nor seniority. Real competence involves knowledge, judgment, and the willingness to bear responsibility when things go wrong. A hierarchy that rewards competence invites people to grow, to take initiative, to stretch themselves toward higher standards. It signals that effort and excellence are visible, that progress is possible, that leadership is something to be earned rather than inherited or negotiated through back channels. When competence is not the currency of advancement, the system begins to rot from within. Mediocrity rises. The best people disengage, realizing that their merit is irrelevant in the face of favoritism or politics. Those who play the game, those who flatter the right people, say the right things, or know how to dodge accountability, begin to climb. And the organization suffers. Not just in output, but in morale. Because people know, often unconsciously, when they're working under someone who isn't up to the task. They feel it, and they stop trusting the system. Competence-based hierarchies are not rigid, they are dynamic. They make space for the apprentice to become the master, for the junior to challenge the senior when the facts demand it. They don't silence criticism. They welcome it, because they understand that competence thrives in the presence of truth. In such systems, status is not a weapon, it's a responsibility. Authority flows upward from demonstrated value, not downward from arbitrary titles or personal alliances. This kind of hierarchy is not perfect, but it is just. It encourages people to cultivate their abilities rather than their optics. It aligns personal ambition with organizational health. It punishes incompetence, not harshly but accurately, by refusing to elevate it. And in doing so, it preserves the integrity of the whole. Because when the incompetent are shielded or promoted, the message received by everyone else is clear. You don't have to be good. You just have to be strategic. Human beings have an instinct for dominance hierarchies. This is not a modern invention. It's a biological inheritance. In every social animal, from lobsters to primates, hierarchies form. But what sets human beings apart is our capacity to evaluate merit, to construct hierarchies that are not purely based on strength or aggression, but on wisdom, competence, and trustworthiness. When that capacity is ignored or corrupted, we don't evolve, we regress. A system that ignores competence breeds fear. Not open fear necessarily, but a quiet dread. The knowledge that things are being led by people who cannot handle complexity, who cannot admit error, who will not step aside when someone more capable emerges. In that kind of system, everyone becomes defensive. Innovation dies. Honesty becomes dangerous, and soon, the entire structure begins to hollow out, maintained by habit and image rather than vitality and substance. Competence-based hierarchies are difficult to maintain precisely because they require continuous vigilance. They require humility from those at the top, the courage to reward truth over loyalty, and the institutional clarity to distinguish real ability from political survival. But without such structures, organizations collapse inward. They may appear intact from the outside, but inside, they are governed by a logic that no longer rewards what matters most. Language is not merely a tool for communication. It is the framework through which meaning is constructed. In an organization, the words that are used shape not just what people think, but how they think. The language of an institution becomes its operating system. If the dominant vocabulary emphasizes control, punishment, and compliance, then even the most well-intentioned policies will feel authoritarian. If the language elevates ownership, responsibility, and excellence, then those ideals begin to take root in how people perceive their roles and each other. Symbols like language carry profound weight. They signal what the organization truly values, not what it says it values. A closed-door office may say more about hierarchy than any leadership manual. A disorganized meeting may undermine 100 memos about productivity. Symbols work at a deeper level than logic. They bypass reason and embed themselves in the subconscious, shaping attitudes and behaviors in ways that are often invisible. The dress code, the layout of the office, the tone of internal communications, these are not neutral. They are saturated with meaning. When an organization adopts inflated or euphemistic language, calling layoffs a right-sizing, or referring to burnout as a growth opportunity, it creates cognitive dissonance. People begin to feel that the truth is being obscured. Trust erodes. Trust erodes. They sense that words are being used to manipulate perception rather than reflect reality. Over time, they stop listening altogether. Clarity, even when painful, is more trustworthy than comfort rooted in deception. Words must reflect the moral structure of the organization, not merely its desired image. Leadership language is particularly critical. The metaphors leaders use shape what people believe is possible. If a CEO talks about war rooms and fighting market battles, the culture will skew toward aggression and defensiveness. If instead they speak of stewardship, discipline, and long-term value, the organization will begin to orient itself differently. Leaders are always narrating, even in silence. Their tone sets the emotional baseline. Their choice of words either invites collaboration or provokes self-preservation. Rituals also function as symbolic acts. A weekly meeting that begins with acknowledgments can reinforce a culture of gratitude. A performance review process that includes upward feedback sends a powerful signal about humility and reciprocity. These are not just procedural decisions, they are symbolic commitments. They reflect an underlying philosophy about what kind of relationships the organization believes are worth cultivating. People notice what gets ritualized, and they infer meaning from it. Organizations often underestimate how quickly their language and symbols become decoupled from lived experience. When posters on the wall say integrity first, but ethical concerns are punished, the slogan becomes a form of satire. When leaders preach transparency but withhold information, the symbol becomes a lie. Over time, this breeds not just distrust but contempt. The gap between words and reality becomes a void, and people stop believing that language has any connection to truth at all. Language and symbolism also define the boundary between the personal and the institutional. When an employee is referred to as a resource instead of a human being, the culture shifts subtly toward depersonalization. When policies use abstract, mechanistic terms to describe people's experiences, those people begin to feel like cogs. And once individuals feel interchangeable, their commitment erodes. They no longer see themselves as agents within the system, but as objects being moved by it. The most functional organizations pay close attention to semiotics, the study of signs and meanings, not because they are indulging in theory, but because they understand the human psyche. They recognize that people respond not only to rules and incentives, but to symbols, narratives, and identities. They know that culture is not maintained by logic alone, but by the emotional resonance of the language that's spoken and the images that are consistently reinforced. Accountability is not cruelty. It is not harshness for its own sake, nor is it a mechanism of shame. True accountability is the willingness to face the consequences of one's actions and decisions, for better or worse. It is the moral backbone of any serious endeavor. And yet, many organizations sacrifice accountability on the altar of comfort. They would rather avoid discomfort than confront dysfunction. But comfort that comes at the expense of truth is not peace. It is denial wearing a polite face. When accountability is absent, everyone knows. It doesn't need to be announced. The rules stop applying to everyone equally. Standards soften. Deadlines lose their meaning. Underperformance is tolerated, then normalized. And resentment begins to simmer, not just toward leadership, but among peers. People begin to question why they are trying, why they are taking responsibility when others evade it with impunity. Accountability isn't about punishment. It's about fairness. And fairness is one of the most potent psychological needs in any social structure. A culture that prizes comfort above accountability often masks it in language like a psychological safety or a being supportive. But safety is not the absence of challenge. It is the presence of structure. People feel safe when they know the rules are clear, the expectations are real, and the system is just. Support without standards is infantilization. It tells competent people they cannot be trusted with truth, and it tells struggling people that their failures will be excused rather than addressed. Leaders, especially, must embody accountability before demanding it from others. If a leader cannot admit fault, cannot own a poor decision, or cannot tolerate criticism, they cannot credibly enforce standards. People do not follow titles, they follow character. A leader who accepts responsibility creates a culture where others feel empowered to do the same. A leader who deflects blame or cloaks mistakes and spin creates a culture of anxiety and concealment. People learn quickly where the real lines are. Accountability is also the source of meaning. When individuals know that their actions have real consequences, that their work matters, that their failures cost something, and their victories are recognized, they become invested. They lean in. Comfort without responsibility breeds boredom. People rise to meet expectations when they believe the system respects their effort enough to tell the truth about its outcomes. Avoiding accountability in the name of kindness is often a mask for cowardice. It's easier to avoid a difficult conversation than to deliver hard feedback with clarity and care. But discomfort is not harm. In fact, honest confrontation, done with respect and precision, is a sign of regard. It communicates that the person is worth the effort, that their potential is taken seriously, that they are not being written off or talked about behind closed doors, but being invited to improve. A lack of accountability creates moral confusion. People begin to wonder, what matters here? Who decides? Is anyone watching? These questions do not arise in environments where standards are real and consistently applied. But when infractions are ignored or quietly accommodated, the boundaries of behavior become ambiguous. And in ambiguity, people retreat. They disengage, become cautious, or begin to imitate the worst examples rather than the best. Comfort is seductive because it promises harmony. But it is a fragile harmony, shallow, brittle, and short-lived. Accountability introduces tension, but it's the tension of progress. It's the friction necessary to generate clarity, discipline, and excellence. It is the adult posture in a world that too often prefers to remain adolescent in its conflict avoidance and emotional indulgence. An organization that cannot tolerate the discomfort of accountability is one that cannot grow beyond its current limitations. Transparency is often spoken about with reverence, as though merely invoking the word will produce trust. But transparency is not a slogan. It is not a checkbox on a value statement or a public gesture made in carefully controlled doses. Real transparency is a discipline. It is the continuous, often uncomfortable act of telling the truth, not just when it's convenient or flattering, but when it exposes mistakes, reveals doubt, or forces difficult conversations. It is a moral posture, not a marketing tool. People don't lose trust because they hear bad news. They lose trust when they sense they are being manipulated, when information is withheld under the pretense of protection or professionalism. In reality, people handle truth better than they are given credit for. What they cannot stomach is the sense that something is being hidden, that decisions are being made in rooms they'll never see, or that leadership is engaged in narrative control rather than authentic communication. Transparency fails when it is practiced selectively. Information is power, and organizations that hoard it are declaring, whether consciously or not, that only a few can be trusted to handle complexity. This not only breeds resentment, it breeds infantilization. It trains people to stop asking questions, to wait passively for official stories, and to treat institutional silence as a cue for disengagement. Transparency, in contrast, invites people into the process. It says, you can handle the truth. You're part of this. You deserve to know. Transparent systems don't just share outcomes, they explain reasoning. They show how decisions were made, what trade-offs were considered, and where uncertainty remains. This level of disclosure may feel vulnerable, especially to leaders who are used to portraying confidence. But it is precisely this kind of openness that earns credibility. People don't expect perfection. They expect honesty. They want to know the logic, even if they disagree with the conclusion. Partial transparency is often worse than none. When leadership shares just enough to appear open, but withholds the parts that matter, they create a climate of paranoia. People begin to read between the lines. Rumors fill the gaps. Cynicism metastasizes. Because in the absence of full context, people create their own stories, and those stories are rarely generous. This is how mistrust becomes cultural. Not from one lie, but from 1,000 omissions that quietly accumulate into suspicion. Transparency must also be internal, not just external. It's easy to craft a public-facing image of openness while maintaining a closed culture behind the scenes, but people within the system know the truth. They see the difference between words and reality. A company that proclaims transparency but punishes dissent or conceals performance metrics is not transparent. It is performative. And the deeper the gap between image and experience, the more corrosive the effect on morale. Practicing real transparency means tolerating discomfort. It means admitting that not everything is under control, that some questions don't yet have answers, and that mistakes have been made. It requires leaders to place truth above their own image, to endure the momentary awkwardness of honesty for the long-term gain of integrity. This isn't easy. It goes against every instinct of self-preservation. But it's the only way to build trust that lasts beyond good quarters and polished reports. Transparency is not an act of generosity. It is a requirement for any system that wishes to function on the basis of trust and mutual respect. It tells people that their awareness is valued, that they are not merely subjects of decisions but participants in them. When people are treated as capable of understanding the truth, they begin to behave as though their decisions matter. And when that happens, transparency stops being a strategy and becomes a shared ethic woven into the culture itself. Trust does not emerge from comfort, ease, or convenience. It is forged in the presence of risk. People trust when they witness someone foregoing immediate gain for the sake of a higher principle, when they see that an individual or a system is willing to pay a cost to uphold what is right. Sacrifice, then, is the evidence of sincerity. It is what proves that values are not just decorative but binding, that integrity is more than posturing. When leaders make decisions that benefit others at their own expense, whether that means declining a personal bonus to preserve jobs, taking public responsibility for an organizational failure, or defending an unpopular truth, they create moral capital. These acts are not merely symbolic, they shift the emotional structure of the system. People begin to feel that the leader is trustworthy not because of charisma or rhetoric, but because they are anchored in something deeper than self-interest. In contrast, when those in power consistently protect themselves while exposing others to risk, trust evaporates. It doesn't matter how intelligent or skilled they are. If people sense that their leaders will choose personal comfort over collective good, the social contract breaks. It doesn't matter how it does. No one will follow wholeheartedly someone they suspect will abandon them at the first sign of difficulty. Loyalty cannot be demanded. It must be inspired through consistent acts of self-restraint and sacrifice. Sacrifice also creates alignment. When everyone in an organization sees that consequences are shared, when wins are collective, and losses are not quietly pushed down the ladder, they begin to operate with unity. There's a psychological shift from a me to a we. But this shift only occurs when people believe that the burdens and privileges of the system are fairly distributed. Sacrifice from the top is what gives permission for sacrifice at every level. It sets the moral tone. Trust grows strongest in moments of tension, when the easy road is available, but deliberately not taken. This might mean rejecting a dishonest but profitable deal, admitting an internal error before it becomes a scandal, or choosing to listen rather than dominate when criticism arises. These decisions cost something: reputation, revenue, ego, but they pay a different kind of dividend. A culture where people believe that truth is more important than optics, and that their dignity is more valuable than spin. The absence of sacrifice leads to symbolic gestures with no weight behind them. Public apologies that aren't backed by restitution, value statements that never shape decisions, policies that exist only for show, all of these are interpreted, rightly, as manipulations. People watch what you are willing to lose for the sake of your stated principles. If you're not willing to lose anything, your principles mean nothing. And once that's understood, trust becomes impossible to restore. Sacrifice also communicates seriousness. It reveals that a leader or a system is not playing games. That when a standard is declared, it will be upheld, even when it hurts. This kind of moral seriousness is rare, and people instinctively respect it. They may not always agree, but they recognize that they are dealing with something real, something grounded, something they can count on. It is this predictability of character forged through sacrifice that allows trust to deepen over time. There is a reason why the most trusted figures in any culture are not the most powerful, but the ones who have suffered for what they believe. Sacrifice is proof of belief. It is what distinguishes ideology from integrity, signaling from substance. In an organizational context, it is the moment when someone says, in action rather than in words, "I will not protect myself at your expense." I am bound to something greater than my own comfort. Culture is often spoken of as if it were a fixed structure, something codified in policy, articulated in vision statements, or defined by an off-site retreat. But culture is not created in declarations. It is created in behavior. Not sweeping proclamations, but small, repeated acts. Every choice made under pressure, every decision about what to tolerate, every conversation that's avoided or pursued, these shape the invisible moral atmosphere of an organization more than any formal document ever could. What you do when it's inconvenient reveals what you actually value. If a manager praises honesty but punishes those who deliver uncomfortable truths, then the culture will adapt accordingly. People are not stupid. They watch closely. They see which actions are rewarded, which are ignored, and which are quietly penalized. Over time, these patterns teach them how to survive within the system. Culture, in this sense, is not what you claim. It's what people learn they must do to avoid shame or gain recognition. The mistake organizations make is assuming culture is something you can design in abstraction and then roll out like software. But people don't respond to abstractions, they respond to lived experience. Culture emerges from habits. How meetings begin, how conflict is resolved, how performance is evaluated, how people speak to one another when emotions run high. These are the crucibles in which values are either embodied or betrayed, and each repetition of these behaviors reinforces a norm. There is no such thing as a neutral act. Everything contributes. When someone holds a boundary respectfully, when they intervene in a small injustice, when they acknowledge the work no one else noticed, these are cultural moments. They may seem minor in isolation, but they accumulate. They create precedent, and precedent becomes expectation. Expectations over time become identity. That's how cultures form, from the inside out, act by act, day by day. The opposite is also true. Every time someone looks the other way when standards are violated, every time an unethical decision is justified for the sake of short-term results, the culture shifts. A crack appears in the foundation. And if left unchecked, those cracks multiply. What was once an exception becomes the norm. And then, eventually, the culture rewrites itself entirely, not by design, but by drift. And by the time anyone notices, the damage is deeply embedded. Culture is maintained or degraded by the lowest level of behavior that leadership is willing to tolerate. This is why silence is never neutral.